Now, Deputy Ellis, are you?
Well, good Carlock. Time on Buiach Larch Aaron Billishaw. It is not hard to conclude that we are in an escalating housing and homeless crisis. Effectively, we have an emergency crisis. In fact, we are at the point where it is now out of control. The figures speak for themselves. Almost 92,000 families on the social housing list, not including close to 9,000 housing assistance payment tenancies, up to the second quarter of 2017. There is a record number of homeless. There are more than 5,000 homeless adults and 3,048 children accessing emergency accommodation in the state. 46% of all homeless people are under 24 years of age. The statistics, dramatic as they are, do not convey each personal tragedy. Each individual has a personal story of anguish and despair. And behind each of these figures is a father, a mother, a child or a family or an individual that has been failed by this government. The most effective way to address the housing crisis is to obviously increase the housing supply. The Department of Housing currently calculates its housing completion statistics using connections to the ESB network. However, concerns have been raised about the level of accuracy in these figures. When set against other data sets such as the stamp duty transactions, building completion certs and building energy regulation certs, the Department of Housing figures appear significantly inflated. CSO statistics confirm that there is a problem with the accuracy of government housing completion figures. These figures get skewed when, for example, a house has been empty for more than 2 years. The owner must apply for a new ESB connection. This can result in vacant units, refurbished homes and other existing empty properties being classified within the new housing completion figures, thus distorting the true housing completion rates. The figures for completions rates issued by the Department of Housing could in reality be exaggerated by more than 50%. But the government continues to use ESB connection data as a means of measuring housing completion rates. The Minister has proposed that 3,800 new social and affordable housing units will be built in 2018. These houses will be built by local authorities and approved housing bodies. However, this will not go anywhere near addressing the current escalating housing and homeless crisis. Sinn Féin, in our submission to the review Rebuilding Ireland, propose more realistic figures to meet housing requirements. We propose 10,000 new social houses to be built each year, amounting to over 50,000 over a 5-year period. We showed that this can be done and financed in our alternative budget. In addition, we believe that the government should abandon the expensive use of PPPs, joint ventures and so on to develop mixed tenure estates and regeneration projects on public land. Such estates should include social and affordable housing, rentable affordable based on need. And they should also have the associated social and economic amenities and infrastructure in parallel with any new housing. The government and previous governments have placed far too much reliance on the private sector. This has led to increased rents and a shortage of long-term rental accommodation. People are finding it increasingly difficult to find rental property, and when they do, the rents are often exorbitant. We hear stories each day of how even professionals and families with 2 incomes are finding it a struggle to pay rent or even to save money. Many rental properties are beyond the reach of low-income families, including those in receipt of the housing assistance payment. That is why Sinn Féin had argued for the introduction of rent controls, or as we hear this new buzzword, the rent certainty. This should be based on the consumer price index and tied to inflation. and not the pressure zone system that you have in place now. Sinn Féin believes that the provision of affordable housing for average income earners should be a priority for this government. Varying schemes rolled out by the government, such as the affordable rental scheme, have yet to be developed. Others, such as the Help the Boy scheme, only pushed up housing prices. The Planning Rebate Scheme and the Local Infrastructure Housing Activation Fund have also proved unsuccessful at delivering affordable rental or purchase housing. Sinn Féin continually argued that affordable rental homes could be provided through existing vacant housing stock. While the government continues to adhere to deeply flawed policies and housing plans, and while the government has an over-reliance on the private sector to deliver social housing solutions and does not provide adequate resources and funding, then we will always have a housing and homeless crisis. The disastrous changing of our planning laws, whereby under Part 5 we now get 10% of any new scheme instead of the previous 10% social and 10% affordable. That has had a huge negative impact on the delivery of social housing. It was a disaster and should never have happened. We should have left the 20% there. It just never made any sense. We've not even got a senior citizen scheme in Dublin City Council. And remember this, if we had a senior citizen schemes, we're open to financial contributions from people who will give up their house. In return, they might have to pay the council a third of their money or a quarter of their money, depending on their age. And that's another means of getting more money. And we're talking about finances. It's also a means to contribute towards new housing and should be ring-fenced towards new housing. The mortgage, the rent scheme has delivered less than 200 units. What a disaster. It could have been utilised, it could have been very effective, but it has not been pushed. And there's various different reasons why the government hasn't pushed this. The vacant homes and businesses, you know, all we've seen is places left, right and centre across the country empty. Businesses newly built in the so-called Celtic Tiger area. We've seen them everywhere across the city and across the country. And the wider use of co-op housing, using local authorities' lands, should be pushed and pushed harder. And we should be looking at building bigger and bigger schemes, because this thing of doing small infills is every bit as costly. The whole process is every bit as tedious as going through 4 or 5 or 6 houses in one scheme. We should be looking at increasing the sizes in the local authority areas. Co-op houses, co-op organisations such as O'Coulon and Ballymun is an example of how we could use more co-op housing at a lower price. And we can use the structural funds which you've put aside to start using those lands. I think it's very important that this is done. There are enough resources to tackle housing and health in this country. The two big main areas in this country that we're failing and are failing abysmally. But it's not all down to money. It's also down to ideology and choices. Money obviously comes into it, and it's how you get that money and how you approach it. And we should also be outlawing the hoarding of lands. This is a practice that has set prices at a very, very high level, and it's certainly we need to push that further and further and to stop that outlawing of hoarding of lands. The more use of NAMA, the funding that NAMA has gotten, the funds that NAMA have raised, should be used. And we have failed to tackle the issue of where we've all met with credit unions who've said that they've money available. I don't know why we haven't gone and talked to these unions and figured out a way that they could be tied into getting funding, you know, that we badly need. The European structural funds are there. the financial agencies, which we can borrow at low rates. There's no excuse in terms of not being able to raise money on the basis, in many of the local authorities, on the amount of housing stock they have, similar to what's done with the voluntary housing bodies. This housing crisis could have been resolved. There's no doubt, with the right will and the right mind, it could have been resolved. And, you know, I find it in the budget where we offer senior citizens €5, we give them a rise of €5. I mean, the ideology that's behind that, instead of looking at the health system we have in the house, the housing, transport issues, looking at all these, looking at the whole structural funding that's required in this state to try and improve all life for everyone. We should be looking at that. But this is down to mindset in many cases. Tá macrí briste, tá gar céim ann I dtaca le titíocht agus sláinte, níl gá bheith ann, tá sé ann, tá slí chun é a thucarú ach níl an tuil ann.
Go raibh míle maith go dtí cheasta, Go Misisiúr.